By first light in 1910, in the frozen hills of rural Vermont, a farmer's daughter walked out into winter air so cold it burned the lungs, carrying a tin lamp and a wool shawl pulled tight around her shoulders. She was sent to cross a narrow creek and fetch milk from the neighbor's homestead half a mile through bare trees. The ice had held all week. The weather was bitter but steady, the kind of January cold that settles in hard and doesn't break until March. Her parents watched her lamp move across the yard, a small yellow glow swaying between the fence posts, and then it vanished behind the line of birch and hemlock that marked the creek bed. She never reached the neighbor's door. When men went looking an hour after sunrise, they found the girl's shawl half frozen into the creek, still faintly warm to the touch, while the ice around it was unbroken and thick enough to hold a team of horses. There were small boot prints leading down from the farmhouse to the bank, clear and deliberate in the snow, but none on the far side and none returning. The lamp was gone. The milk pail was gone. The girl was gone. For years afterward, people along that valley claimed they heard careful, uneven footsteps crossing the creek on clear nights, when there was no ice at all. Her name was Clara Ashford. She was 14 years old, the kind of girl who rose before her parents without being told, who kept the stove fed and the chickens calm through the worst of winter, who walked alone in the dark, because she'd done it 100 times before, and there was no reason to think this morning would be any different. The family lived on a hillside farm outside a hamlet so small it never made it onto most maps of Vermont. Just a scattering of homesteads and barns connected by dirt lanes and lengths of pasture fence. The nearest town with a post office was 4 miles south, reachable only by wagon in good weather. Winters there were long and silent and unforgiving. Smoke rose thin from chimneys. Frost stayed hard on the ground from November straight through to March. The creek ran narrow and shallow between the two farms, fed by a spring higher up the ridge that never quite froze, even in the coldest years. By mid-January, the creek itself was frozen solid, smooth as poured glass in some places, rippled and white in others where the current had pushed up before the freeze set in. People crossed it on foot without thinking. Children slid across it on their way to the one-room schoolhouse a mile west. It was nothing to fear. It had never taken anyone. Not in living memory. Not until that morning. Clara left the house a little before 6 o'clock, while the sky was still black and the stars were hard and bright overhead. Her father had checked the ice the day before, walking the full width of it with a birch pole to test for weak spots. He'd found none. Her mother wrapped bread and a jar of preserves in a cloth sack for the neighbor woman, who'd been unwell with fever and hadn't left her house in a week. Clara wore her everyday boots, laced tight to the ankle, and the gray wool shawl her grandmother had knit years back, thick enough to keep the wind off her neck and shoulders. The lamp swung from her right hand, wick trimmed low to save oil, the flame steady behind its glass. Her parents stood in the doorway and watched her figure grow smaller against the snow. They saw the light bob and weave between the bare trunks of the trees. They heard nothing unusual. No cry, no crack of ice, no call for help. No sound at all except the wind moving through the pine branches higher on the ridge. When the lamp didn't reappear on the far side after 10 minutes, when it should have been visible climbing the slope toward the neighbor's porch, her father pulled on his coat and his heavy boots and went after her. He found the boot prints first, small, even steps down the slope from their yard, through the gap in the thorn fence where Clara always passed, and straight across the snow to the creek bank. The prints were clear, deliberate. They stopped at the very edge of the ice. On the ice itself, there was nothing. No mark, no scrape, no smudge, no sign anyone had stepped onto it. The surface was perfect and undisturbed, thick as a man's forearm, solid enough that he walked out onto it without hesitation. The cold came up through the soles of his boots. The ice groaned once under his weight, but it held firm. Halfway across, he saw the shawl. It lay folded in a way that made no sense. One corner was frozen into the ice, as if it had been pressed there deliberately, held down long enough for the cold to bite through the wool and lock it in place. The rest of it was draped neat and loose on top, not crumpled or thrown, but arranged. He bent down and touched it with his bare hand. The wool was still faintly warm, not hot, not fresh from the body, but warm enough that it shouldn't have been. Not after sitting on frozen water in air cold enough to make his breath come out white and heavy. He pulled the shawl free. Beneath it, the ice showed no crack, no hole, no thin spot, no place where a body could have slipped through. It was as solid and smooth as the rest. He turned it over in his hands. There was no tear, no blood, no sign of struggle. Just warmth that had no source. He shouted Clara's name. The sound carried flat and dead across the empty pasture. No echo, no answer. He crossed to the far bank and climbed the slope, boots breaking through the crust of snow. No boot prints there either. No sign she'd ever reached the other side. He walked the tree line north and south, scanning every drift, every low thicket of brush, every shadow between the trunks. Nothing. He went back to his own house and woke the nearest neighbors. By mid-morning, 8 men were combing the creek in both directions, checking every foot of ice, every hollow along the banks, every place a body might have fallen or been dragged. Dogs were brought in from 2 farms over. They sniffed the shawl and whined, noses pressed low to the ground, tails down. When they reached the creek, they sat down hard on the snow and refused to go farther. One of them, a hound that had tracked deer through worse terrain, lay flat on the ice with its belly pressed to the surface and would not move until its owner dragged it back by the collar, the dog yelping the whole way. The lamp was never found. The milk pail was never found. Clara Ashford was never found. By nightfall, the men had searched a full mile upstream and a mile down. They checked the spring where the creek began, breaking ice with iron bars and dragging hooks through water so cold it made their hands ache even through thick gloves. They found nothing. They checked the neighbor's property. They checked the road. They checked the schoolhouse, though it had been empty for days. One of the men, a logger who'd worked that valley for 30 years and knew every ridge and hollow, said he heard something just after noon. A sound like 2 careful footsteps crossing the ice from the south bank to the north, slow and deliberate, the way a person walks when they're testing the surface. He turned fast, hand already reaching for the axe on his belt, but there was no one there. The ice was empty. Another man checking the far tree line swore he saw a flicker of yellow light deep in the hemlocks, low to the ground, moving steady like a carried lamp. When he ran toward it, calling Clara's name, the light blinked out. He reached the spot. There were no tracks, no warmth in the air, nothing. That night, Clara's mother folded the shawl with shaking hands and put it in a wooden box in the back room of the house. She would not look at it after that. She would not touch it again. She would not speak her daughter's name out loud for 3 years. For weeks she woke before dawn and stood at the kitchen window with her arms wrapped around herself, watching the place where Clara's lamp had disappeared into the trees. She never saw it again. But others did. A farmhand crossing the creek at dusk 2 weeks later said he saw a small light moving through the trees on the north side, swaying just the way a hand-carried lamp would sway when someone walked fast. He called out. The light went dark immediately, like a wick snuffed by a sudden wind. A woman walking home from a neighbor's house in early March when the ice was starting to crack and groan under the warmer days, claimed she heard light footsteps on the frozen creek behind her, quick and uneven like a girl running to catch up. She did not turn around. She walked faster, and the footsteps stopped. A boy gathering firewood along the south bank in April swore he saw boot prints appear in the mud one morning, small and clear, leading from the water's edge up into the trees. When his father came to look an hour later, the prints were gone. By spring, the ice melted. The creek ran clear and cold, the way it always had. People still crossed it, but not alone anymore, and never after dark. Mothers told their daughters to take the long way around even in summer, even when the water was low enough to step over on flat stones. Men in Vermont still don't talk much about that winter, not in detail, not where strangers can hear. But the old ones, those who remember when it happened or whose parents remembered and passed the story down, they'll tell you this much. If you hear footsteps on ice in January, you don't look back to see who's walking. And if you see a light moving through bare trees before the sun comes up, you let it go where it's going. Because the girl who carried that lamp across the creek in 1910 never made it to the other side, and whatever came back in her place Whatever left that shawl warm on solid ice with no tracks to follow isn't something you want to meet alone in the cold and the dark. The search began in earnest the next morning. By dawn, 20 men had gathered at the Ashford farm, some from homesteads as far as 6 miles away, summoned by boys sent on horseback through the night. They brought axes, iron bars, coils of rope, and canvas sacks to carry anything they might find. The women stayed behind, brewing coffee in tin pots and wrapping bread and cold meat for the men to take with them. No one spoke much. The air was still bitterly cold, the sky low and gray, the kind of weather that sits heavy on the chest and makes every breath visible. They divided into 3 groups. One would work the creek upstream toward the spring. One would work downstream toward the valley where the water widened and deepened before spilling into the river. The third would comb the woods on both sides, marking their progress with strips of cloth tied to branches so no ground would be covered twice. Clara's father walked with the upstream group. He hadn't slept. His face was gray, his hands shaking as he tied a red rag to the first fence post. They moved slowly, checking every foot of ground, every drift of snow, every hollow where a body might have rolled or been dragged. The ice along the creek was still solid. They tested it with axes, chopping holes every 20 yards to check the depth and flow beneath. The water ran black and slow, no more than a foot deep in most places. They dragged hooks through it. They found nothing. One man thought he saw something pale beneath the surface near a stand of birch trees and called the others over. They broke the ice with bars and pulled out a length of rotted cloth, old and stained, nothing to do with Clara. By midday they had covered half a mile. The dogs were brought up again. They whined and pulled toward the creek, but when they reached the bank they stopped cold, ears flat, and would not cross. The downstream group fared no better. They worked their way through thickets of thorn and alder, boots breaking through ice-crusted mud, checking every low place where runoff pooled in warmer months. They found deer tracks. They found the frozen carcass of a fox, stiff and half buried in snow. They found no sign of Clara. One of the men, a mill hand from the valley town, said he heard something around noon. A sound like a tin pail being set down on stone, clear and sharp, coming from the north side of the creek. He called out. 3 others stopped and listened. They heard nothing after that. When they crossed to check, there was no pail, no stone large enough to make that sound, no prints in the snow. Another man swore he smelled lamp oil, faint but unmistakable, drifting through the trees near a bend in the creek. They searched the area for an hour. They found nothing. The third group, working the woods, moved in a line, shoulder to shoulder, eyes on the ground. They tied white rags to the trees as they went, marking the edge of their search. Every 50 yards they stopped and called Clara's name in unison, then stood silent and listened. The forest gave nothing back. No birds, no wind, just the creak of frozen branches and the sound of their own breath. A boy no older than 16 walking near the southern edge of the line said he saw a flicker of movement ahead of him, low and quick, like someone crouching behind a hemlock trunk. He ran toward it, calling for the others. When he reached the tree, there was nothing there. But in the snow at the base of the trunk, he found a single boot print. Small, pointed north. He knelt and touched it. The snow inside the print was loose and soft as if it had just been made. The men gathered around. They followed the direction it pointed, walking slow, axes ready. After 30 yards, they found another print. Then another. 5 in total, each one clear and deliberate, leading deeper into the woods. Then the print stopped. The snow ahead was smooth and undisturbed. There was no sign anyone had turned back. No sign anyone had climbed a tree or veered off the path. The prints simply ended, as if whoever made them had lifted off the ground mid-stride. By the 3rd day, the search had become a ritual. Men took turns walking the same ground over and over, convinced they had missed something the first time. They broke more ice. They dragged the deeper pools with weighted hooks. They checked the springhead again, climbing higher up the ridge than anyone normally went in winter, boots sinking into drifts that came up past their knees. They found nothing. The women brought food to the edge of the search line twice a day, standing with shawls wrapped tight, eyes red from cold and sleeplessness. Clara's mother did not come. She stayed in the house with the curtains drawn, sitting in the same chair by the stove, hands folded in her lap, waiting. Some of the older men began to whisper among themselves. They'd lived in Vermont all their lives. They'd seen hard winters, bad winters, winters that took livestock and occasionally took men who wandered too far from shelter. But this was different. This was something else. On the fourth day, they found the second shawl. It was a boy who saw it first, the same boy who'd found the boot prints in the woods. He was walking the south bank alone, checking a section that had already been searched twice, when he saw a scrap of gray wool caught on a low branch near the water's edge. He called for his father. The men came running. They pulled the wool free carefully as if it might crumble in their hands. It was the same gray wool as Clara's shawl, the same weave, the same frayed edge along one corner, but Clara's shawl was already in the wooden box in her mother's house. It had been there for 4 days. They knew this. They had all seen it. One of the older men, a farmer who'd known Clara since she was born, took the wool and turned it over slowly. It was damp, but not frozen. It smelled faintly of lamp oil. He looked at the others and said nothing. They wrapped it in a clean cloth and brought it back to the Ashford farm. Clara's father opened the wooden box in the back room. The original shawl was still there, folded just as it had been, still faintly warm when he touched it. He laid the second piece of wool beside it. They were identical, same color, same weight, same small tear along the hem where Clara had caught it on a fence post the previous autumn. The men stood in the doorway and stared. No one wanted to speak. No one wanted to say out loud what they were all thinking. Finally, one of them, a man who worked the logging camps farther north and had a reputation for being steady and practical, said quietly, "Maybe someone's playing at something." But his voice had no conviction in it. Another man, older, shook his head. "Nobody plays at this," he said. "Not here. Not in Vermont." They searched for another week. They walked every trail. They checked every barn, every shed, every abandoned structure within 5 miles. They questioned travelers on the valley road. They sent word to the towns downriver asking if anyone had seen a girl matching Clara's description. Nothing came back. The minister from the nearest parish came up to the farm and held a service in the Ashfords' front room. 20 people crowded in, praying for Clara's safe return. Some of the women wept. Clara's mother sat silent, hands folded, eyes fixed on the window that looked out toward the creek. After the service, the minister pulled the older men aside and asked, in a low voice, if there was anything unusual about the place, anything in the valley's history that might explain what had happened. The men exchanged glances. One of them said, "People don't talk about it much, but there've been stories." The minister waited. "About what?" he asked. The man looked uncomfortable. "About things that walk the creek at night," he said finally. "Things that sound like people but aren't." By the end of the second week, most of the men had returned to their own work. Fences needed mending. Livestock needed tending. Life did not stop, even when a girl vanished without a trace. But something had changed in the valley. People walked differently now. They looked over their shoulders. They kept their children closer to the house after dark. The older hands, those who'd been there longest, started telling the younger ones not to cross the creek alone before sunrise. 2 men, always, one of them said. Never one. When asked why, he didn't answer. He just looked toward the trees and shook his head. Clara's father kept searching. Every morning he walked the creek from end to end, eyes on the ground, calling her name. He did this for a month, then 2. His wife begged him to stop. He wouldn't. By March, when the ice began to crack and the water ran fast and loud again, he finally gave up. But he never went near the creek after dark. None of them did. And on still nights, when the air was cold enough to carry sound a long way, some of them claimed they heard it again. That soft, careful sound of footsteps on ice, even though the ice was gone. 2 steps, sometimes 3. Then silence. Men in Vermont still tell the younger ones, if you hear someone walking behind you on a winter night near water, you keep moving forward. You don't stop. You don't turn around. Because whatever makes that sound isn't looking for company, it's looking for something else. On the morning they finally gave up the search, one of the men went back to the place where the shawl had been found on the ice. He stood there for a long time looking down. The ice had melted in that spot earlier than the rest, leaving a small circle of open water. He knelt and touched the surface. The water was warmer than it should have been. Not by much. Just enough to notice. Just enough to make his hand pull back on its own. By the third week, the search had stopped being a search and started being something else. The men no longer expected to find Clara alive. Most of them no longer expected to find her at all. But they kept going out, day after day, walking the same ground they'd already walked, checking the same thickets, the same hollows, the same bends in the creek. It was as if stopping would mean admitting something they couldn't say out loud. They worked in silence now, faces hard, eyes distant. The women brought food and left it on the porch of the Ashford farm without knocking. Clara's mother had stopped coming to the door. Her father slept in the barn most nights, unwilling to lie in a bed while his daughter was still missing. The minister came by twice more, but there was nothing left to say. The prayers had been prayed. The hymns had been sung. What remained was the waiting, and the not knowing, and the slow creeping certainty that whatever had happened to Clara Ashford was not something that could be explained by weather, or accident, or any natural cause. It was during the fourth week that things began to happen that no one could ignore. A group of men were working the north side of the creek, near the place where the second shawl had been found, when one of them saw something white wedged between two stones at the water's edge. He called the others over. It was a scrap of paper, folded twice, damp but not soaked, tucked carefully into a gap in the rocks as if someone had placed it there deliberately. He pulled it out with shaking hands and unfolded it. The paper was ordinary, the kind used for schoolwork or grocery lists. The handwriting was small and neat, written in pencil. It said, "I'm still here." That was all. 3 words, no signature, no date. But the handwriting was Clara's. Her father recognized it immediately when they brought it to him. He took the paper and held it up to the light from the window, hands trembling so badly the paper shook. It was hers, no question. The same careful loops on the letters, the same slight slant to the right, the same way she crossed her T's with a short, firm stroke. He'd seen her handwriting 1,000 times, on notes left for her mother, on arithmetic lessons spread across the kitchen table, on the label she'd written for the jar of preserves she'd been carrying the morning she disappeared. This was Clara's hand. But Clara had been missing for nearly a month. The paper should not exist. One of the men asked, voice low and careful, if Clara had written anything like that before, if maybe the note was old, something she'd written weeks or months earlier and dropped without noticing. Clara's father shook his head slowly. She didn't write notes like this, he said. She had no reason to. He turned the paper over. The back was blank. He brought it close to his face and smelled it. Lamp oil. Faint, but unmistakable. The same smell that had been on the second shawl. He set the paper down on the table and stepped back as if it had burned him. No one touched it after that. It stayed there for days, sitting in the middle of the kitchen table, the words visible to anyone who came into the house. Some of the women refused to look at it. One of them made the sign of the cross when she passed by. Another whispered that it wasn't right, that the dead shouldn't be able to write. And someone else snapped back that Clara wasn't dead, couldn't be dead, because dead girls don't leave notes. But no one really believed she was alive. Not anymore. 2 days after the note was found, a man checking the tree line near the southern ridge saw boot prints in soft mud near a deer trail. Small prints, the same size and shape as Clara's. They led from the creek up into the woods, following the trail for about 30 yards before disappearing into a patch of bare rock. He called for the others. They came running, axes and ropes in hand, ready for anything. The prints were fresh. The mud was still damp, still soft enough that when one of the men pressed his thumb into the edge of the print, it left a clear mark. But the ground around the prints had been searched 6 times already. Every inch of it, and there had been no rain, no snowmelt, nothing that would have revealed old prints hidden beneath ice or frozen soil. These prints had not been there the day before. Everyone agreed on that. The men followed the trail up the ridge as far as they could, moving slowly, eyes on the ground. The prints led to the rock face and stopped. There was no way up. No handholds, no ledges, no place a person could have climbed without rope and help. They stood there in the cold, breath steaming, staring at the rock. Finally, one of them said what they were all thinking. She didn't climb it. Another man, older, his face deeply lined from years of outdoor work, shook his head. Then where did she go? No one answered. The theories started after that, quietly at first, whispered between neighbors when no one else was listening, then louder, more insistent, until it seemed like everyone in the valley had an explanation, and none of them made sense. Some said Clara had run away, that she'd been unhappy at home, or frightened of something, or in love with someone her parents didn't approve of, and she'd staged the whole thing to make it look like an accident. But no one could explain the shawl, still warm on solid ice. No one could explain the note written in her hand appearing weeks after she vanished. No one could explain the boot prints leading to nowhere. Others said she'd been taken, that someone had been watching her, waiting for the right moment, and had grabbed her on the ice and carried her off before she could scream. But there were no other prints, no horse tracks, no wagon ruts, no sign of struggle. And the dogs, trained hunting dogs that could track a deer through a blizzard, had refused to cross the creek, refused even to try. A few of the older people, those who'd lived in Vermont their whole lives and whose parents and grandparents had lived there before them, said the land itself had taken her, that there were places in the valley, old places, places that had been there long before the farms and the fences and the roads, that didn't follow the rules the way other places did. They said the creek was one of those places, that it had always been strange even before Clara disappeared, that animals avoided it in certain seasons, that the ice froze in patterns that didn't match the current, that people had heard things near the water at night. Footsteps, voices, the sound of something moving through the trees that was too careful, too deliberate, to be an animal. But when pressed, none of them would say exactly what they thought had happened. They'd just shake their heads and look away and say, "The land takes what it wants, always has." By the 5th week, the search had ended. Officially, at least. Clara's father still went out most mornings, walking the same paths, checking the same places. But he went alone now. The other men had returned to their work. Planting season was coming. Fences needed mending. Livestock needed tending. Life moved forward, even when it felt wrong to let it. The minister held a memorial service in the small church 4 miles south, though there was no body to bury. Clara's mother attended, dressed in black, her face pale and expressionless. She did not cry. She did not speak. When the service ended, she walked home alone, refusing the offers of neighbors who wanted to accompany her. That night, she went into the back room where the wooden box was kept and opened it. The 2 shawls were still inside, folded neatly side by side, identical in every way. She touched the first one. It was warm. Not hot, not fresh from the body, but warm enough that it shouldn't have been, not after sitting in a closed box for over a month. She closed the lid and locked the door. She never opened the box again. But others saw things. A farmhand working late one evening in early April claimed he saw a light moving across the creek, low to the ground, swaying in the steady rhythm of a carried lamp. He stopped and watched it for nearly a minute, too frightened to call out. The light moved north, disappeared into the trees, and was gone. And a woman hanging laundry at dawn said she heard a girl's voice calling from the woods on the far side of the water, faint and high. The words unclear, but the tone unmistakable. Someone asking for help. She dropped the wet sheet she was holding and ran inside, bolting the door behind her. She did not go outside alone after that, not even in daylight. A boy walking to school in May saw a figure standing at the edge of the creek, small and still, wrapped in a gray shawl. He blinked and the figure was gone. He told his teacher. She told him not to walk that way anymore, and the school quietly changed the route children were expected to take, adding half a mile to the journey but keeping them away from the water. After that spring, nobody in Vermont rode that stretch of creek alone before sunrise. Not then, not now. Parents told their children to stay clear of the water, especially in winter, especially when the ice looked solid. The older hands told the younger ones that if you heard footsteps behind you near the creek, you didn't stop to see who it was. You kept walking. You didn't answer if someone called your name, not unless you could see them clearly in front of you in good daylight. And you never ever crossed the creek alone after dark. These rules weren't written down anywhere. They didn't need to be. They were passed from father to son, mother to daughter, neighbor to neighbor, the way important things always are in small places where memory runs long and silence runs deep. The note stayed on the Ashford kitchen table for 6 weeks. Then Clara's father folded it carefully, placed it in the wooden box with the 2 shawls, and locked the door to the back room. He told his wife he was going to burn the box, that keeping it was driving her mad, driving both of them mad. But he didn't. He couldn't. Because some part of him, some part he would never admit out loud, believed that as long as the box existed, as long as the shawls stayed warm and the note stayed folded, Clara was still out there somewhere, still trying to come home, still leaving signs. And if he destroyed those signs, if he burned the only proof she'd ever existed, then she'd be gone forever, and he'd have to live with that. So the box stayed locked, and the shawls stayed warm, and on cold nights in Vermont, when the wind moved through the bare trees and the creek ran black and silent under the stars, people still claimed they heard it, the soft, uneven sound of a girl's footsteps crossing the ice, even when there was no ice at all. Years passed. The Ashford farm was sold in 1914, 4 years after Clara disappeared. Her father had stopped working the land by then, spending his days walking the creek or sitting silent in the barn, staring at nothing. Her mother had died the winter before, quietly, in her sleep, though people said it wasn't sleep that took her, but the weight of not knowing. The new family that bought the farm was young, from Massachusetts, with no knowledge of what had happened there. They learned quickly. The first night they spent in the house, the wife woke to the sound of footsteps crossing the yard toward the creek. She looked out the window and saw a small light moving through the darkness, swaying steady and low to the ground. By morning, neighbors had come to warn them. Don't cross the creek alone. Don't go near the water after dark. Don't answer if you hear someone calling your name from the trees. The family stayed 2 years, then left. They never said why. The farm stood empty after that for more than a decade. By 1920, the story of Clara Ashford had become something the people of that valley carried with them, the way they carried the knowledge of hard winters and bad harvests. Something passed down, quietly, without ceremony, but never forgotten. Children, who hadn't been born when Clara vanished, grew up knowing the rules. Stay away from the creek in winter. Walk in pairs before sunrise. Don't stop if you hear footsteps behind you. They didn't know why, not at first, but they obeyed, and when they were old enough, their parents told them. Some versions of the story were longer than others. Some included details that others left out. But the core remained the same. A girl went out one morning to cross a frozen creek and never came back. Her shawl was found warm on solid ice. Her boot prints led to the water and stopped, and for years afterward, people saw lights in the trees, heard footsteps on the ice, found things that should not have been there. Notes, prints, pieces of cloth, appearing long after the search had ended. The creek itself changed. Not in any way you could measure with instruments or mark on a map, but in the way people moved around it, the way they spoke about it, the careful distance they kept. The old wooden bridge that crossed near the Ashford property rotted and collapsed in a storm in 1925. When the county sent men to rebuild it, 3 of them refused to work alone on the site. One of them, a carpenter from a town 15 miles south, said he'd heard something while measuring the support beams, a girl's voice, soft and clear, asking for help. He'd looked up. No one was there. He finished the job, took his pay, and never came back. The new bridge was built 30 yards downstream, farther from the place where Clara had disappeared. No one objected. No one asked why. In 1932, during a particularly cold February, a schoolteacher walking home at dusk saw a small figure standing at the edge of the creek, wrapped in a gray shawl, facing the water. The teacher stopped and called out. The figure didn't move. The teacher called again, louder this time, starting to walk toward it. The figure turned its head slowly, just enough that the teacher could see the side of its face in the failing light. It was a girl, young, pale. The teacher took 3 more steps forward, already reaching out, already thinking she'd found someone lost or hurt, already opening her mouth to ask if the girl was all right. Then the figure stepped backward onto the ice. Except there was no ice, not in February of that year, the warmest winter in a decade, and disappeared. Just vanished, mid-step, as if she'd walked through a door that wasn't there. The teacher stood frozen for a long moment, breath caught in her throat, then turned and ran. She reached the nearest farmhouse a quarter-mile away and pounded on the door until someone answered. She was shaking so hard she could barely speak. When she finally got the words out, the farmer nodded slowly, as if he'd been expecting this. "You saw her?" he said. It wasn't a question. The teacher never walked that road again. The wooden box that Clara's father had locked in the back room of the Ashford house was found by salvagers in 1940, after the house had been abandoned for years and the roof had started to collapse. They pried open the door to the back room, looking for anything worth selling, and found the box under a pile of rotted blankets. They opened it. Inside were 2 gray wool shawls, identical, folded neatly side by side, and a small piece of paper with 3 words written in pencil. "I'm still here." One of the salvagers touched the first shawl and jerked his hand back. It was warm. Not just warm, hot almost, as if it had been pulled fresh from a body. He dropped the lid and backed away. They left the box where it was and never went back. The house was torn down in 1947. No one knows what happened to the box after that. Some say it was burned with the rest of the debris. Others say it was taken by someone who didn't know any better, carried off to another town, another state, where the warmth would eventually fade and the shawls would become just cloth again. But people in Vermont don't believe that. They believe the box is still out there somewhere, still holding those 2 pieces of wool that should have gone cold a lifetime ago, but never did. By the 1950s, most of the people who'd been alive when Clara disappeared were gone. Her father had died in 1923, her mother years before that. The men who'd searched the creek were old now, or dead, their sons and daughters carrying the story forward. But the rules hadn't changed. People still avoided the creek alone. Parents still told their children not to cross it after dark. The valley had learned to live around the missing girl, the way you learn to live around a scar. It's always there, always visible, always tender when pressed. New families moved in. Some stayed, some left after a season or 2, unsettled by things they couldn't name. Sounds in the night, lights where no lights should be, the way their dogs refused to go near the water. The ones who stayed learned quickly. They learned which paths to avoid, which times of day were safe, which sounds to ignore. They learned not to ask too many questions, and they learned that the people who'd lived there longest wouldn't talk about Clara Ashford in any detail, wouldn't say her name out loud near the creek, wouldn't go into the woods on the north side of the water even in broad daylight. There were other incidents over the years. Small things mostly. A hunter in 1958 found a tin lamp at the base of a hemlock tree, old and rusted but still intact. The glass chimney unbroken. He brought it back to town and showed it to an old woman who'd lived in the valley her entire life. She looked at it for a long moment, then told him to take it back where he found it and leave it there. He asked why. She wouldn't say. A group of teenagers camping near the creek in the summer of 1965 heard footsteps circling their campsite all night. Slow, deliberate, the sound of someone walking carefully on frozen ground. Even though it was July and the earth was soft and warm, in the morning, they found bootprints in the dirt around the fire, small and even, leading from the creek to the edge of their camp and then back again. They packed up and left before noon. One of them, years later, said he'd never been so frightened in his life, not because of what they heard, but because of what they didn't hear. No breathing, no rustling of cloth, no sound of a body moving through space. Just footsteps, clear and steady, walking around them in the dark. In 1972, the state put up a historical marker near the site of the old Ashford farm. It mentioned the family, the farm's establishment in the 1880s, the sale of the property in 1914. It did not mention Clara. Local residents didn't object. They knew why. Some stories don't belong on roadside plaques. Some stories belong in the quiet spaces between what's said and what's remembered, carried forward not by monuments but by warnings, by rules. by the careful way people move through certain places as if the ground itself is listening. By the time a century had passed, the story had softened in some ways, sharpened in others. Clara Ashford was no longer a real girl to most people, no longer someone with a face and a voice and a life that had been interrupted. She'd become a legend, a cautionary tale, the girl who walked out one morning and never came back. But to the people who still lived in that valley, who still farmed the land and walked the roads and raised their children in the shadow of those hills, she was more than that. She was the reason you didn't cross the creek alone. She was the reason you didn't answer when you heard your name called from the trees. She was the cold knowledge passed from one generation to the next that there are places in the world where the rules bend, where the ground doesn't give back what it takes, where something walks at night that sounds like a person but isn't. And the shawl, wherever it is now, if it still exists, is still warm. People in Vermont still talk about Clara Ashford, though not often, and never casually. If you ask the old ones, the ones whose grandparents remembered that winter in 1910, they'll tell you 3 versions of what happened. The first version is simple. She ran away. She was 14, maybe unhappy, maybe frightened of something at home, and she staged the disappearance to cover her tracks. The second version is darker. Someone took her. Someone had been watching, waiting, and grabbed her on the ice before she could scream, carrying her off so quickly and carefully that even the dogs couldn't follow. The third version is the one nobody says out loud, the one that lives in the silence after the first 2 have been offered and dismissed. That version says the creek itself took her, that she stepped onto the ice and passed through it. Not down into water, but somewhere else, somewhere the rules don't work the way they should, that she's still there trying to come back, leaving signs, footprints, notes, warmth on cloth that should be cold, because she never made it all the way across and she never will. Which version makes sense here? The human one, the criminal one, or the impossible one nobody in Vermont dares to say out loud? What detail in this story should not exist in a normal world? The shawl that stayed warm for a month, the note written in her hand weeks after she vanished, the bootprints that led to nowhere, the second shawl that appeared when the first was already locked away. And why do people still follow rules made 100 years ago for a girl who disappeared on a cold morning in January? Subscribe so you don't miss the next story.